Hello everybody, happy Maundy Thursday. This is the fourth meditation in our series of meditations on our Master's last mortal days. And this is the day, and especially the evening, in which we remember, and I hope meditate on, the significance of our Master's meal with his disciples before his arrest, his rejection by the leaders of his people, his unjust trials before very hypocritical leaders, and then his terrible suffering and death the next day. So this was a meal that Jesus himself said he eagerly desired to share with his disciples. And he loved them, and it comes out so clearly that he loved them as you read the texts. I wanted to just share with you, in case you wanted to take some time this afternoon or evening to look at these. In Matthew 26, starting in verse 17, in Mark 14, verse 12, in Luke 22, verse 7, or in John 13, and it carries all the way through to 17. It tells the stories, or the narratives, of Jesus with his disciples in that last meal. So, John's telling is, of course, like most tellings of John, goes a different direction than the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm going to focus on Matthew, Mark, and Luke's flow of things. But John's is beautiful as well, and that's John 13 and 17. I hope you'll take time to look at those, because in John you see the washing of the feet, which I would really love to talk about as well, but I have to kind of choose. And so what I would love for you to do is look at those texts, again, Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 13 and following, and see the heart of your Master towards his disciples. Well, as the synoptics tell it, it begins on that first day of the week-long festival of the Jews called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. We would call it Passover. And the special meal at the beginning of this week was what we're focusing on now. And Jesus sends two of his disciples into the city, into Jerusalem. No doubt it's at the beginning of the day while they're in Bethany, where they're sleeping every night. And the disciples ask, what do you want us to do to get ready for the big meal, the big Seder? And Jesus tells them, go into the city, Jerusalem, and find a man carrying a water jar. Follow him to where he is, the household he serves or belongs to. And when you get to that house, talk to the owner of the house and say the master needs a place to have a meal with his disciples. Now, it seems like this is all prearranged, just like that donkey that they had to go fetch for him to enter Jerusalem a week before. And so they do that. They go in. And just like he said, the owner took them up to a second-story room, an upstairs room, and as Jesus said, it was large and already furnished. So they were ready for Jesus, and the disciples had to go and make the preparations for the food. Now, as the texts tell you, this is the day you're supposed to do the sacrifice of the lamb, because it's that lamb that you sacrifice at the temple that you'll eat, just like they did back in Egypt. So before I get to the meal that Jesus shared, and by the way, I'm doing this today, not because I'm trying to be cash, but because when you think of Jesus eating this meal with his disciples, I hope you'll picture in your mind reclining at a low table. This happens to be a coffee table style thing, and maybe this is about the same height. Sitting on cushions like they would have done. And so you're leaning towards the table and your feet are away from the table at this kind of meal. They didn't always eat this way, but at special meals, this is how they would eat. And the descriptions match that as well. So if you're thinking of Da Vinci's Last Supper picture, don't. A very westernized picture of things. And it's good for getting everyone facial shots forward. No, think of a more intimate, in the round, low table, as the NIV says, reclining or lounging at the table. Anywho, when it comes time for evening, the sacrifice has already been made, the lamb's already been slaughtered, and now the meat for the lamb has been cooked. It's time for the meal. The Seder meal, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but has various elements that are very symbolic. And it's all meant to get the Jewish mind to go back to Egypt when their ancestors were slaves there. And I won't go into the full story because it takes so much time. But if you remember, the whole point of the Passover week-long celebration was to remind the nation and their children who needed to remember these marvelous stories of God's salvation in their story. That when they were suffering in Egypt, God saw our suffering. He heard our groaning, our cries for help and justice at the hands of these wicked Egyptians, these cruel masters. And God came to us, children, through Moses, and demanded that Pharaoh let us go. Pharaoh wouldn't, and so God punished Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt with 10 terrible plagues. And the final plague was the death of the firstborn of every family. And it was for every family, including the Israelites, unless they would do the one thing God said would spare them when the destroyer came through. And anyone could do this and be spared. It didn't have to be a Hebrew. Even the Egyptians, if they would listen, they would be spared too. You had to take a year-old lamb, which means a sheep or a goat, and it had to be visibly pure and perfect looking. And you would kill that lamb and take its blood, its life, and you would put it over the doorpost as a signal that you're obeying Yahweh, that you're trusting him. And when the destroyer comes through, he'll see the blood on the doorpost and know that you've trusted Yahweh and have obeyed his word, and he'll pass over your house. And lives will be spared in your family. The firstborn will live. It's such a dramatic story, and I hope you've read it in the scriptures, certainly in Exodus. If you get a chance, watch the movie Prince of Egypt, because they portray it really well. Ooh, I get chills when I think about what happened then and the way it can be depicted. But this whole celebration was God's commanded way for Israel to always remember what God had done for them, delivering their firstborn, because they were willing to trust and obey him on that night. So, the Seder meal has various parts to it that reminded the people not only of the bitterness of their slavery, but of the joy of their deliverance, and God's gift of the lives of their firstborn being spared. So when Jesus has this meal with his disciples, as I said, he told them, and I love that he said this. Every time I think of this meal, this is one of the chief things that comes to mind. His tender heart towards his friends when he said, I have eagerly desired to share this meal with you. You know, Jesus is under profound stress through his whole final week of mortal life. Even entering Jerusalem, do you remember? It was as joyful as it could be on the outside. But we already know, we've looked at this several days ago on Sunday, that when he, even amidst all the joy, he had a heavy heart. Because as he looked on Jerusalem, he knew she would be destroyed, that her end was coming. And she was missing her chance because she couldn't see it. I mean, there was this weight on our master because he understood what was going on better than anyone could. And as he sat at the meal, I hope you'll think on that while this was a joyful celebration, this is a big deal, by the way, for the Jews, to come to Jerusalem, the city of God, and to be able to eat the meal of their salvation story as a people, to remember God's goodness and mercy to them as his people. They have this celebration in mind. I think the disciples are on cloud nine anyway because they think Jesus is finally on his final steps of taking up the mantle of Messiah to do all they're expecting him to do, because he's in Jerusalem. He's been hailed by the people, all of those things. And by the way, he's been showing the religious leaders that he's top dog, because every time they try to make him look dumb or trap him in his words, they come out the losers. So, I mean, the disciples have no reason to think that anything bad is on the horizon. They must have had the most optimistic view as they sit around the table with Master Jesus. But Jesus, he has this sorrow in his heart because he knows this is his final meal with them as a mortal man, and the last Seder meal. And he says this to them very specifically. This is the last Seder meal I'll have with you until its fulfillment occurs in God's kingdom. So, in his heaviness of heart, he brings them some bad news. And he tells them, one of you. And by the way, Jesus, read the room. This is supposed to be a happy time for us. This is supposed to be a good time for us. We, your friends, and you, our master. But he breaks this terrible news to them because they need to be ready for what's coming. He says, one of you. Not one of them out there. Not one of the people that's been after me this whole time. One of you. my chosen, my closest, trusted friends, one of you is going to betray me. And if you remember, all of them, even Judas, who I'm sure he's just putting on a good show, all of them are like, whoa, 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 no. And then it says they say to each other and then to Jesus directly, wait, not me, is it? No. And it's unthinkable to any of them. How could any of them betray the master they've come to know and love and be loyal to for 3 years plus? And they're the ones, remember, they're the ones that had stuck around when everyone else abandoned Jesus. When he's talking about eat my body, drink my blood, according to John, most of the people listening to him said, oh, that's it, I'm out. And they just ditched him. And Jesus turns to these 12 and he says, are you going to leave too? As if to say, if you've got second thoughts, this is a good time. Go with the crowds here. Get out of here. And Peter spoke for them all. And I love it. Peter, good job. Peter said, but Master, to whom would we go? We believe, we're convinced that you are Messiah. You have the words of life. Yes, that's right. So they've been with him through everything. They've gone to places knowing that if they go there with Jesus, we could die. And they went anyway. So they've proven it. It's not like, they're thinking too highly of themselves because they've never had a chance to show their loyalty. They've been loyal, and now they hear it directly from their master's lips. One of you is going to betray me. Well, we know, don't we? We kind of read the end of that story. It's Judas. And as everyone's asking, could it be me? Couldn't be me. Couldn't possibly be me. And John tells us this detail. He says, he calls himself the one Jesus loved. He was next to Jesus at the table, and he's kind of reclining towards Jesus, leaning in towards Jesus. And Peter says to John, hey, ask him who it is. So John does. He leans back towards Jesus and says, Master, who is it? Who's going to betray you? And Jesus gives a very clear answer. He said, the one to whom I give this bread in the dipping bowl. In the other accounts, it says, the one who dips his bread with me in the dipping bowl. Guess who that was? And even then, even when it was Judas doing that, they didn't quite get it. According to John, when Jesus says to Judas, go do what you're going to do quickly, Judas leaves, but the other disciples are like, oh, I guess he's on an errand for Jesus. Maybe he's going to go give some money to the poor people, like we're used to Jesus having him do, because he's the treasurer. Still, Jesus is the only one who gets it. Because I don't think they could possibly get it. So we get now to the part that we remember whenever we take what we call communion, Lord's Supper, Eucharist. And I want to make sure, I'm not going to spend too long here because I don't want these videos to be terribly long, but I don't want to miss this. What Jesus does when he takes the bread and the wine, and then he gives them a significance that centers on himself. This is one of two things for the Jews sitting around that table. This is either the biggest deal in millennia, or this is blasphemy. Because remember what this meal is. This meal is a God-given, a God-directed remembrance of Yahweh God acting in history to deliver his people. This is centered on Yahweh, not any one human person. This is not even about Moses, the mortal human at the center of the story. It's not about him. This is about Yahweh God doing these works of deliverance for his people. Think now on this. Jesus, a mortal man, a 33-ish year old mortal man, Jewish man, sitting at a table, a low table, on a cushion in an upstairs room in Jerusalem with a bunch of 12 mostly ignorant, mostly uneducated. He sits down with them and he says, now, what millions of Jews have been observing as being about Yahweh's salvation for his people is now going to be about me. And I want you to think of me when you eat these things. Who are you to do that? You can't just do that. I mean, how do you take centuries of tradition about the same exact meaning for all of these things, and then you say, but now, starting right now at this table in this room, it's going to be me. And so if you remember, he takes the bread, and it's the unleavened bread, right? Because it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. No leaven anywhere for a week. Everyone's got to get rid of all the leaven, right? This bread has been made without leaven, so it's the flat, it's the cracker kind, the matzah bread, if you see that at the store. And I think of saltines, to be honest with you. It seems very similar. But the point being, it's the unleavened bread, which don't skip over that too quickly, because this is his body, he says. And not every time, but often, yeast in Jesus' teaching means hypocrisy. He warned the disciples at one time, watch out for the hypocrisy, or the yeast of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, and we're told he meant hypocrisy. Jesus' body was free of sin, of the hypocrisy, of empty religious activity. He was the authentic worshiper. He's the authentic human. He's the authentic God-man, if you like. There's nothing about him that isn't true, and just, and loving, and authentic. So he takes this bread and he says, this is no longer about how quickly you're going to be leaving Egypt. Because remember, they had to do unleavened bread because they're going to get out of there quick. As soon as word comes, you're out of here. No. This is about my body. And this is broken for you. And it's actually, I imagine him breaking it as he says the word broken, as he hands it out for them to consume. Listen, he didn't say to eat the lamb's meat as his body. He said the bread is his body. What? Why not when they eat the lamb? There's a lot that might be involved there, but I do think of what he said in the book of John to all the people, not just to his disciples, that he was the manna, the bread sent down from heaven, the true manna. Because in the manna in the wilderness, remember, they'd eat it and they'd get hungry again. They'd have to have more tomorrow. But Jesus said, if you eat this bread, it gives you eternal life. Very much like he said to the woman at the well, if you drink the water I give you, it'll give you eternal life. You don't have to keep coming back for more. Then he took the cup. And in Luke's version, he does the cup twice, but the second one seems to be the focal one. After the meal, Luke says, he took up the cup, and he gave thanks both for the bread and for the cup. And I hope you give thanks for your food, not just as a nice religious tradition, but because Jesus showed us that's right. It's so right to thank God for these things that sustain us. Anyway, he took the cup and he thanked God for it and he passed it to them, but he told them, this is the blood of the covenant, or the new covenant, according to Luke's writing, in my blood. And he said to be poured out for the forgiveness of many. In one it says, for you, meaning to those disciples. And I was thinking on this, I was meditating, that's what we're doing here, isn't it? The 12, and of course Judas, yeah, you're like, Judas, but I mean all of the 12, 3+ years with Jesus, serving him by the power of the Spirit. They were authorized to cast out demons, heal the sick, all of those things. Raise dead people even. Even for them he needed to shed his blood. And if that doesn't cause us to realize, no matter what our pedigree is, no matter what our past experiences are, every single person needs the blood of Christ to save them. Just like every person in Egypt needed the blood of the lamb on the doorpost to save them. Moses' house where he was needed the blood. Ah, but he's Moses. Yes, but he needs the blood to spare him and his family. That's true for every individual. This blood was poured out for those 12, and that blood was poured out for the many, all of us too. So last thought I want to make sure we have before, and I don't want, again, just to be too long for you, but please think with me on what it means that this was blood that you're consuming. Now, different Christians differ on whether this actually becomes his body and blood, transubstantiation in the Eucharist, or if this is symbolic, and I don't think we even have to go there right now to realize when Jesus told us to consume blood, even if symbolically, that goes against everything the Jews were told about what to do with blood. You never consume it. Because a life is in the blood, God told them. You don't get to consume someone else's life. So you eat the meat of the animal, you don't eat the blood of the animal, right? The blood goes in the ground. The blood belongs to God, not to you. Whoa. Jesus said, consume the blood, my blood. Why? Because life is in the blood, and you have no life apart from me. I hope that when you take it, whether it's all together in a church family, or right now as you're at home with just a few people maybe, or even if you're by yourself, take some bread, tortilla, cracker, anything, okay? Take a drink. Hopefully it can be red-colored, maybe, I hope. But if not, that's all right. But think on the body, the blood of your master. Honor him. Because without this life, you don't have life. Without consuming his life, without taking it into your being, you don't have it. Every single one of us needs his body and blood. And this covenant is so much greater and so much more binding and longer lasting than the covenant at Sinai. This is not the blood of bulls sprinkled. This is the blood of Messiah, whose one life is powerful enough to bring purity to all lives. Think on that. No amount of animals could even cover one human, but this one man, divinely sent, this one man's blood and life is enough for everyone? Oh, let's meditate together on the greatness of our Master, what he did at that table to make himself the center of the salvation story, trumping even the salvation from Egypt. This is the salvation from sin, from death, and from the grip of Satan. Praise God with me that your Master was delighted to have a meal, and now he shares it with us. I love you. May the Lord bless you this Maundy, Thursday as you remember our Master with whoever you can. And may he bless you until we can see each other again. Bye-bye.